Okay, so I'm going to just start off with a quick acknowledgement of country, and I wanted to acknowledge the Bidjigal people of the Eora Nation whose land we're meeting on today, and to acknowledge elders past and present and any Aboriginal people who may be here with us today. So I have the pleasure of getting to introduce colleagues from the Kirby Institute, which is where I did my PhD, so I got to know Mo quite a bit there. Garrett Prestage, Associate Professor Garrett Prestage from the Kirby, who I sneakily heard last year was quite involved in some Mardi Gras stuff historically over time and has been quite heavily an influencer in that. And Mo is submitting his PhD next year, maybe? Possibly. One paper to go. Hang in there. So they're both going to report on the Flux Study today, the Following Lives Undergoing Change, which I think many of you have heard about. And I'll leave it to both of you to talk more about that. Just briefly, we're going to have drinks afterwards, as per usual, so please stick around, don't rush off, and it'll give you an opportunity to chat to Mo and Garrett and find out any more information afterwards. So Mo's going to get started.
Is this working?
So that's the audio recorder. So that's going to stay there, and then there's that.
Hi all. Mo, I'm the project coordinator for the Flux Study. Today, Garrett and I will be talking about drug use among gay and bisexual men and describe the context of its use. Specifically, I'll talk about the current state of drug use in Australia, introduce you to the Flux Study and how we captured these data, and present you with what we've found so far. I've got a lot of slides to get through, so I'll go through them really quickly to give Garrett more time to contextualise what these results actually mean. So, what is the current state of drug use in Australia? To answer this, we looked at data from the National Drug Strategy Household Survey. When comparing the prevalence of drug use, we clearly see that in the general population, gay and bisexual men are using drugs at a much higher rate than their heterosexual male counterparts. These higher rates of drug use among gay and bisexual men have been consistently shown in drug research over the years, both nationally and internationally. So we know this, why does it matter? To answer that question, I'm going to use data from the Healthy Men study. To illustrate the associated risks of drug use, I will focus on two drugs in particular, one legal, one illegal. What they found was, after controlling for all other variables, men who used methamphetamines were 1.8 times more likely to HIV seroconvert compared to those that didn't. This increases to 4.1 times more likely when the legal drug erectile dysfunction medication was used. But when both were used together, it jumps up to 8.1 times more likely. Within more adventurous gay community subcultures, the interconnectedness of sexual behaviour and drug use may be key in understanding HIV risk behaviours and is an important priority in HIV prevention. So based on the importance of understanding drug use among gay men, the Flux Study was formed. Flux, which stands for Following Lives Undergoing Change, is Australia's first entirely online cohort study of drug use among gay and bisexual men. Led by Garrett, the chief investigators include researchers from the Kirby Institute, the Centre for Social Research and Health, NDUC, Archers, Anglia Ruskin University in London, and our partner investigators include ACON and BAC. To answer the study aims, such as why do men start and stop using drugs, Flux could not be a simple one-off questionnaire, but rather a detailed 200-item questionnaire that looks at all aspects of life. This means that it would take participants, with capturing this much data, it would take participants anywhere between 30 to 45 minutes to complete one survey. We asked them to do this twice a year. To complicate things, we needed to recruit a minimum of 1,400 men to provide us with enough statistical power to run any analysis. To add to that complication, each participant has their own unique history and their own unique drug-using behaviours, which means that at each round, each participant is receiving a personalised questionnaire. So we have this almost impossible task. How do we run it? You automate the flux out of it. With that, let me introduce you to an automated system that runs Flux. This system is called FAME. FAME, which stands for the Flux Automated Management E-System, is a world-first data capture system that was designed specifically for the Flux Study. FAME automatically maintains and runs the cohort with almost no researcher involvement. With a variety of adaptable features, the one I will present today is how FAME tracks participants' progression throughout the study and pinpoint the moment of their changes in behaviour. So I'll use an example of participant 123, who has a history of drug use, and participant 321. So at baseline, participant 123 has used, 321 hasn't. At first follow-up, 123 has stopped using drugs, but 321 has started using drugs. At that point, FAME will look back at the participant's previous response and trigger the appropriate questions based on their changes. It is this innovative system that now gives us the opportunity to track what behaviours have changed in a participant's life, whether they be drug use, mental health, social connection, whatever it is, and look at what factors might be associated with those changes. To further reduce research burden, on research staff, FAME automatically generates participants' unique link. So for each unique survey, it's a unique link. Automatically generates that survey, automatically populates the URL into the email address along with their Flux name, and automatically sends it when the participant's due to complete their next round. Once the participant receives their email, all they need to do is click on their link and they're automatically redirected to their survey. The greatest asset of FAME is whether we want a cohort study of 1,400 men nationally or 1 million men internationally, there is absolutely no change in the amount of money spent or the time allocated to run a cohort study. It is this system that's contributed to the success of Flux and for 2 PrEP trials in Australia, the EPIC New South Wales and PrEP WA. Alright, so we have now this developed tool, great questionnaire and a topic to investigate, but we have no idea whether we can recruit 1,400 men given the length of the survey and whether the FAME system actually works in a real life setting. So we launched on August of 2014. In total, 3,200 men replied to the baseline survey, of which 2,500 men joined the study. This is almost double what we were initially expecting. This slide briefly provides the sample profile of the Flux, this Flux profile sample. The only thing to know here is that it looks very much similar to every other sample of gay men in Australia. Like I said earlier, I have a lot of slides to get through, so for each slide I'm just going to talk about the key take-home message. Looking at baseline prevalence of drug use, we can see that most men who have used drugs have not done so in the previous 6 months. Focusing specifically on the recent use, the green bar, the most common drug used in this sample was amyl and cannabis, but nearly 1 in 5 were using any type of methamphetamine. Although injecting drug use in this sample was rare, the gold bar, it was relatively a common method among men who used crystal. Looking at the frequency of each use and paying particular attention to the blue section, the blue bars, we can see that most drug use in the previous 6 months was infrequent. So pretty much that those who had used drugs in the 6 months were using it once or twice. The only exception to this is crystal, where with nearly half of those who used crystal were using it at least monthly in their previous 6 months. So that's an overview of what the baseline prevalence looked like. Moving forward, I'm just going to focus on the drugs that are commonly used for Chemsex and also talk about PrEP. If we compare men in our sample that have never used crystal, have a history of crystal use, or recently used crystal, we can see some differences. Among those who used crystal, and particularly among those who used it recently, they were more likely to engage in condomless sex or group sex with a casual partner and have a greater number of sexual partners. Condomless sex, group sex, and greater number of sexual partners are key indicators for intensive sex partying and adventurous sex. If we look at the same 3 groups again, we can see that for those who used crystal, and again those who used crystal more recently, they were more socially engaged with gay friends who used crystal, more likely to use drugs for the purposes of sex, and more likely to have partners who would only have sex if they were using crystal. From this, it is evident that recent crystal use, that those who used crystal more recently were more socially engaged with other gay men who used crystal, and more socially connected to intensive sex partying networks. So we've got all these associations and factors that are in it. We collect all these associations and factors in an attempt to understand crystal use. Well, the other thing Flux can do is just ask them. So we asked men in our sample to ascribe reasons for their crystal use. I won't go into details of this slide, but the main thing to note is that in the previous 6 months, those who used crystal were citing reasons as fun and partying. There were also quite a few who specified elements of sex partying. I don't have the slides here, but for the same analysis that we did for GHB use showed very similar patterns and reasons for use. Flux also explores the good and bad experiences of drug use. Overall, among all recent users, the majority reported far more good experiences than bad experiences. The good experiences include better sex, better partying, and greater social connection. Again, these were very similar results to what was found among those who used GHB recently. Among all the men who had ever reported overdosing, just over 1 in 5 had overdosed once in their lifetime, and 2.8 had overdosed more than once. Overdose was more common among men who used crystal, GHB, or who injected drugs. A regression analysis shows that the main predictor of overdose was frequency of use. That is, men who used these drugs more frequently were more likely to overdose. So how do the characteristics of crystal users compare to other drugs, specifically erectile dysfunction medications and GHB? In a multivariate analysis, it appears that these drugs are mostly used for the purposes of enhancing sex. Looking at this, we can start to piece together a picture with these drugs in that these Chemsex drugs were individually associated with both riskier sex and being more socially connected with friends who use drugs. Now within Flux, so the actual questionnaire involves several validated measures, established and validated measures, 2 of which look for indicators on anxiety and depression. Among those who used drugs recently, we looked for any indicators of adverse mental health for any drug used. Not one illicit drug was associated with anxiety or depression, but tobacco was. This changes when we look at dependent use. Using another scale that screens for indicators of dependence, we have approximately 28% of recent crystal users who show signs of dependence. Among those men, both anxiety and depression were associated with dependent crystal use. So that's a very, very quick snapshot of what our baseline data look like. I'll quickly just talk about, present what's going on 1 year later. To start, just a quick note, retention over the year was very strong. We had just over 80% providing us with any follow-up data, and over 70% were retained at the 12-month period, fully retained at the 12-month period. In general, the prevalence of drug use over time remained relatively stable, despite a lot of movements coming in and out of drug use. That is, a lot of people that started drugs, some people were starting crystal, other people were stopping. So it remains relatively stable over time. For this slide, I've just focused on the prevalence of crystal and GHB to illustrate this example. Given that we now have cohort data to work with, we can start looking at incidence rates. What that means is we can start to measure the probability of drug initiation among gay and bisexual men over time. Using the Flux sample, we've looked at the previous 12 months. The overall incidence rate for each drug use, that is, the rate of initiation for each drug type, was very high. Looking specifically at crystal, the incidence rate was almost 3% in the previous 12 months. If we turn our attention to the incident rate of drug use, of drug initiation by age, we can see that most initiation was more common among younger men. What you can't see in this slide is that for crystal, it's the line with the red diamond data points, which you can see it. Drug initiation was not more common among younger men. So crystal initiation appears to occur anytime between someone's early 20s right through to their early 40s. We've got all these numbers. Who are the people that are giving us these data? As mentioned earlier, FAME has a chance to pinpoint the moment someone's behaviours change and ask them what's going on. To give some example of what we found, these quotes are, so there's just quotes we've pulled out that look at reasons for starting GHB use. A friend introduced me to it, and I loved it. I loved the crazy intensity of false connections during sex, when nothing else matters, and I love the sudden abrupt wakefulness and awareness of how crystal it is when it is over, of how crazy it is when it is over. Another man said that new group situations are more socially acceptable. So his new group situations more socially acceptable, less inhibited, and trusted the people more. And finally, one guy said that he was offered it and you only live once. If we turn our attention to the flip side, looking at incidence rates for people who have stopped using each drug, these proportions are also high. Although notably, the rate of crystal users who have stopped is is lower than most. This suggests that perhaps crystal use tended to be more long term, especially when compared to other drug types. But it is important to note here that, if you recall from our earlier slide, the frequency of use was relatively inconsistent. So we can't really be sure that what we're measuring is actual cessation, or is it just reflecting the fact that some men didn't use drugs in the previous round. We'd need more long-term follow-up data to know what's really happening. We asked men why they stopped. One man simply stated that he was not able to locate a dealer. Another man states that his social networks have changed, so he didn't feel the need to use drugs much. Here we can see some sort of link back to social networks and some sort of you can see access and social networks being an influencing role. Another man states, don't have the time to stay awake for 2 days and feel like crap after 3 days. And finally, my favourite, because I'm pretty sure this guy is talking about me, I don't want to end up like those old crazy synopsis stories. So let's look closer at these men who actually started using crystal. If we compare the characteristics of men who never used crystal with those who started using crystal at follow-up, we see at baseline there isn't actually much difference between them. For those who initiated crystal, except for those who did initiate crystal, at baseline were more socially engaged with other gay men who used crystal. If we look at the same groups again, we can see that if we're comparing those who didn't start crystal, those who did initiate at follow-up, but compare the characteristics at follow-up, we see that those who initiated crystal become more sexually active, were more likely to engage in condomless sex with casual partners. This indicates that the initiation of crystal accompanies the greater engagement in intensive sex party networks. What is also important to add here is that those who started using crystal were also more likely to commence PrEP use. So among men who used drugs for sex, specifically those who used the key Chemsex drugs such as crystal and EDM, it would appear that those who added PrEP to their regime were more sexually active and more likely to engage in condomless sex with both fuck buddies and casual partners. Also, so among the men who were already at high risk, those who were seemingly at even higher risk often started PrEP, possibly to offset the potential risks. For my last few slides, I'll talk a little bit about the normalisation of drug use. So do our participants think it's acceptable to use party drugs with their gay friends? Overall, drug use was relatively acceptable within most gay men's friendship networks, especially, and not too surprisingly, among people who use party drugs themselves, and particularly among men who are socially connected with other gay men. This suggests that peer networks are very important for understanding the patterns of drug use in gay and bisexual men. I've pulled out a couple of quotes to speak to the normalisation of drug use among gay and bisexual men. The first says he wants to try some drugs because he feels like he's missing out. While another man says he went off them for a while and wasn't interested, but then he's been out partying with friends and hanging out with friends who had them, and he took them because they had them, I suppose. So this speaks to the normalisation of drug use within gay men's social networks. The normalisation of drugs is usually also reflected in the fact that very few men found it particularly difficult to obtain drugs, and often used it just because it was available. They tended to get their they did tend to get their drugs through their own friendship networks, whether it be, Okay, now that I've just thrown a whole bunch of numbers, I'm going to invite Garrett up to kind of explain what it all means.
Do I need to put some other microphone on?
No.
No? Okay. So I'll just summarise that. So, use of most illicit drugs was very high. Most of their use, though, was infrequent and irregular. A key, possibly the main reason for use of many drugs, was clearly in relation to sex partying. Men using chemsex-associated drugs, such as methamphetamine and GHB, and EDM as well, also tend to engage in behaviours that are commonly associated with intensive sex partying networks, like group sex, condomless sex. They also tended to be strongly engaged in gay community and immersed in networks of gay friends that also use drugs, especially methamphetamine. And they also often cite very positive outcomes from their drug use in terms of both partying and friendships. But that said, a minority, of course, describe negative outcomes, including overdose, and these tend to be most common among the men who use those drugs more frequently. Rates of uptake for each drug type were very high, particularly among younger men, and that's what you'd expect. A very large proportion of men also stop using each drug over time, and given that their use is mostly infrequent, what appears to be stopping use over time may just be that they didn't happen to use it during that survey period. So we'll need more time to be able to really measure prevalence and incidence, both of commencement and cessation, over time. Men who commenced methamphetamine and other chemsex drugs had been more socially engaged with other gay men who used crystal before they started, but were otherwise fairly similar to other men. However, when they commenced methamphetamine, that coincided with them also being much more sexually active and engaging in riskier sex and sex partying generally, and they commenced PrEP. Men who used chemsex drugs also tended to start using PrEP, and those who were more engaged in intensive sex partying generally, both in terms of drugs and sex, were even more likely to start using PrEP, which is definitely a good thing. In general, gay men tend to report that drug use is fairly acceptable among their friends, and, as you'd expect, those who use drugs reported way more acceptability among their friends than those who didn't use drugs. So overall, drug use tends to be fairly ubiquitous for a lot of gay men. I think the take-home message here is not to assume pathology when it comes to drug use among gay men, which is a bit of a daft statement for a lot of you, I know. And yet it does seem to still continually get overlooked. Indeed, I was listening to a leading Australian drugs researcher being interviewed on the radio last week. She was discussing some recent research and noting the likely associations with various pathologies. That in itself isn't a problem. But the way the discussion ended up being framed was that there's an inexorable relationship between mental health and drug use. That those who have mental health issues tend to use drugs, and that drug use tends to lead to mental health problems. None of that is factually incorrect, but it does suggest inevitability, and it ignores non-pathological or functional use, and they didn't once mention fun or pleasure, which seems pretty basic. And that isn't just a feature of the way research is reported. It also tends to be how drug use services and health professionals talk about drug use as well. None of which is surprising. It's the way we're trained to think by a system that demonises pleasure and fetishises healthiness. We look for the marginalised, the problematic, and the dysfunctional because it's our task to find ways that they can become socially connected, functional, and healthy. That's a good thing. But in the process of trying to achieve that worthy goal, we also tend to ignore those that are already well supported, functional, and doing well. This is important in my view because for many, the solution to marginalisation, dysfunction and health-related problems often lies in understanding why others, probably most, are doing just fine. And in the drugs area, that really matters a lot. It's not a new thing for researchers at this centre to learn that many gay men use drugs functionally and that a major factor in this is their social connectedness to other gay men, particularly others that also use drugs. What's new here is the strong quantitative data demonstrating the key role of social connectedness in gay men's uptake of drug use. But what's less clear and requires more probably longer term data is the extent to which that same social connectedness plays a role in frequency of use, dependence, either positive or negative, and long-term use and cessation. Because frankly, at the moment, the Flux data could support both arguments. That being, being more socially connected is associated with both uptake and more problematic drug use, as well as that greater social connection ensures that most drug use among gay men is functional and involves little risk. PrEP adds a particular dimension to this. As with illicit and recreational drug use generally, PrEP uptake is associated with greater social connectedness with gay community. And maybe that's just a function of the way that PrEP has been rolled out. You sort of need to already be socially connected to gay community to have known about how to access PrEP. But we've always known that being more gay community engaged has been the key factor since year dot in gay men learning how to have fun and engage in pleasurable activities in the context of potential harms. And that long predates even HIV and involves a lot more than just potential infections. Knowing who, where, and when and how was critical for gay men's survival through many decades of anti-gay prejudice and danger. So this quote from one of the men about what PrEP represents for men who would otherwise be at high risk captures the sentiment pretty well. It's helped me be more confident sexually and have the freedom to enjoy the kind of sex I like and be less inhibited, less controlled by the dangers associated with my sexuality, and less subject to the stigma that was historically associated with male-on-male sex. It's freeing and humbling, something that our gay forefathers never had the chance to try, and it's led to this kind of powerful new generation of gays that didn't have to self-actualise during the AIDS epidemic, surrounded by death and pain. I feel privileged to be able to be so protected. I think it's a pretty powerful statement. So the idea that men who enter into intensive sex partying contexts are now inclined to commence PrEP isn't surprising. And that being connected to gay community is a key predictor of that is also no particular surprise. The issue here, I think, is how we interpret that in relation to potential harms among men within those networks. PrEP represents a harm reduction strategy, but only in relation to HIV transmission, although the accompanying sexual health screening might be viewed as a useful complementary component that especially applies for these men. Flux data tell us, though, that there are other, more directly drug-related harms that particularly apply to men who are more frequent and dependent users. Even if we can't know at this stage the extent to which greater or lesser gay community connectedness plays a role in these harms, we do know that gay community networks can be utilised to ameliorate those harms. Again, this isn't necessarily new information or a particularly insightful perspective, although it is important to note that Flux will have the capacity, with another couple of years of data, to be able to provide some good, solid, quantitative data to support or negate those assumptions. What's perhaps important to consider, though, is what it means to apply the concepts of community engagement and peer support from the perspective of the functional majority. In this case, what we're talking about is the use of drugs in a context of partying and particularly to enhance sexual pleasure, which is why talking about fun matters. The pathologising argument is that no matter what people say about their own motivations, feelings of shame and self-doubt are unconsciously guiding most people's choices about any risky behaviour. And, of course, drug use is defined as risky. For the record, I don't believe that argument, and I don't find the evidence to support it very strong. But it is undoubtedly true for some more vulnerable individuals. Most people, however, don't consciously turn to drugs or engage in any potentially risky behaviour to absolve underlying feelings of shame and self-doubt. They do it for fun, or because the possibility was on offer, or just to try it. And if they enjoy the experience and they find the downsides were not too bad, then they might do it again. And then, for a few, the old maxim of playing with fire and getting burnt probably does come true. The particular fire that gay men are often playing with mixes two things, drugs and sex, that are often demonised, particularly when done to excess. And that's the core of the problem. What exactly is excess when it comes to drugs and sex? Some years ago, Michael Hurley and I wrote about this while we were still working through the concept of intensive sex partying. We were asked to write about gay men's use of erectile dysfunction medication. The assumption in the request was that gay men must be using these drugs at such high rates because they were having difficulties keeping erections during sex, and that must be due to feelings of insecurity and anxiety. Our argument was quite different. We simply put it down to the fact that gay men are way more sexually active than are their heterosexual equivalents, and among gay men, those who participate in sexually adventurous subcultures are even more sexually active. So it isn't about the need to get it up and keep it up for the weekly bonk that might characterise the common usage of erectile dysfunction medications. For gay men, and particularly for sexually adventurous gay men, it's about the need to get it up in the presence of other drugs that mitigate against that, and to keep it up for quite a long time, and often with many partners. In a sense, what that means is that for these men, the standard of sexual functionality is qualitatively different to those for which the measures of erectile dysfunction were designed. As someone once said to me, you're saying that for some gay men, they're like sexual athletes. And it's like the use of performance enhancement drugs. The average punter doesn't need them unless something has seriously gone wrong. But these sexual athletes need them if they want to perform at the level of their peers. So what then do we mean by excess in relation to gay men and intensive sex partying? For the most part, just mentioning group sex or the average number of partners that gay men have is enough to raise questions of excess, as is pretty much any use of drugs. And yet, most gay men experience sex partying and have multiple partners at some time, and most at least occasionally use drugs. In intensive sex partying networks, though, they often actively pursue chemsex, whereby they put these things together, sex partying and drugs, specifically for the purpose of achieving a sort of sublime excess. Or maybe you could describe it as a controlled excess. They purposefully want to achieve heightened sexual pleasure without the usual restraints. When asked why they might try certain drugs, these quotes indicate that men often referred explicitly to sexual enhancement. First one says, I've heard GHB and ketamine are good. I'm only interested in using drugs to enhance sex, not just general partying. G and crystal, but I'm too chicken because I'm told the sex is amazing. I'd like to try K. It's supposed to be good for fisting. I'm interested in trying G as it sounds like a lot of fun to fuck on. Pretty clearly about sex. And that's the nub of it, surely. The idea of just having fun almost necessarily means a balance between resisting restraint and avoiding disastrous outcomes. The Flux data suggests that most gay men do this fairly well because their drug use is infrequent and is probably not likely to be dependent. But we need longer-term data to know that for sure. Plus, we're seeing good evidence of them taking up PrEP as an addition to their drug use regimens to make their otherwise HIV risky behaviours not so risky. On the other hand, there's a clear minority for whom their patterns of drug use are problematic and who aren't necessarily using risk reduction strategies, including PrEP. Are they long-term dependent users? Do their behaviours put them at risk of negative health and social outcomes? It seems so. But again, we need more long-term data to know just how much of a problem this represents. The key issue, though, in this, as it has been for so much of what's been observed among gay men, at least in Australian research, is the role of gay community engagement. Are peer norms about drugs and sex protective or problematic? Probably both. Peer norms can, of course, be disinhibiting, and perhaps that means that some men who are vulnerable to risk become more so. But also, supportive peer networks can help alleviate those risks by providing people with the tools to reduce risk. The extent to which both of these things apply and what are the specific features of gay community networks that lead to either of these outcomes are essential questions. And we can't answer either of them without being honest about both of them. If we want to ensure that gay men are able to pursue pleasure without being pathologised, then we have to acknowledge that for some men, certain aspects of their experience as gay men means that they are at risk. And likewise, if we want to protect some men from potential harms, then we have to acknowledge that what is perceived as the hedonistic pursuit of pleasure within some gay networks often also provides the strong basis for good mental health, self-confidence and personal support. That's all of what I had to talk about as the implication from the data, but I just quickly will just mention the future of Flux. I've alluded to all this to the fact of we need future data, or more long-term data. We're currently seeking funding to allow us to continue the study, but we do have, because of the nature of the study and how well automated it is, thanks to the work of Mo, we will have the capacity to be able to continue the study at least through 2019. Probably not in as dramatic a way as we'd like it, but we can do that. And finally, just to thank everybody that's involved in the study. That's it. Yeah.
Thank you, that was incredible, both of you. We're going to throw out to audience questions, and I'm going to hear a couple, and then I'm going to ask my own. Carla?
Thanks. I really appreciated the careful interpretation of drug use, pleasure, and subverting the pathology basic discourse. And a bit of shameless self-promotion. There's a special issue of the International Journal of Drug Policy on Drugs and Pleasure released right now, and Martin and I have got an afterword in it reflecting on the previous special issue that was about 10 years ago about drugs and pleasure and so much has changed. But I wonder if there's some more work to do about how Flux can take a particular position about talking about these changing patterns of drug use and whether stopping and cessation are not the right words to use, because you don't know, as you said, you've got to... So whether or not there's a different language that you can develop that is an intervention itself in the field.
It's interesting that you say that, because we actually really struggled with the wording. How do we describe what's going on when we really don't understand it to start with, but we can clearly see that by using the words that typically are used, they're actually implying something that we're pretty sure is not going on. Yeah.
And has a moral framework.
Exactly.
Cessation is something to be desired, whereas, you know,
exactly.
safe use is what is to be desired, whatever people choose to use.
In the actual questionnaire, is the actual wording is, if you were using drugs before and you're not using it now, do you want to say why? So we don't actually use any real language. It's like, we were doing this before, what are you doing now?
Yeah, but when that person finds their dealer again.
Exactly. Exactly. But even though we were pretty careful about the language in the questionnaire, nonetheless, when you take those data and try to interpret it and then present it, and you're stuck with the language, and it really does lead you down that path of pathology all the time.
Resist.
Martin has a question.
I was told to prepare questions, so I was thinking. So I've heard you present on various aspects of this over the last year, I suppose. And I suppose actually on that issue, so this issue of discovering that there are probably few men who meet whatever definition you're using of like highly problematic use. But actually I think you could quantify that. So you keep saying it's a small group, but actually to count, I mean it's one strategy, but countering the argument that there's a huge, there are relatively high levels of use, surprise, in the cohort. There's actually a high level of change, like which now some of the follow-up data is showing. Like, and actually I was listening to the way you're describing it. I think there's a temptation to kind of highlight because of what the cohort's trying to do, to highlight the incident use, how many people started, but the levels of cessation, regardless of the problematic definition, actually show more people stop, basically, than try.
Yeah.
So within that, the men who actually start using something heavier and then sustain it and then are more at risk of dependence or mental health problems, are probably a really, really small group, but you're kind of hiding them in that because you want to talk about how most drug use is unproblematic. But actually that's quite a well-rehearsed argument. So I actually think putting the number on it, going, it's 2% of men per year who are going to have experience harm in some way. You also skated over, and you've talked about it before, Mo has, that using the dependence measure, the severity and dependence scale, but you've contrasted that before with what men actually perceive as problematic.
Yeah.
So the top-down classification versus the bottom-up, and they don't quite match, which is always the way. So actually, the number of men who would be motivated or would feel the need for help, and I have a fight. Sorry,
well, we've got more questions about that, and that's an even larger group when you frame it that particular way.
Oh, but as you've always said, like if you ask people if they need help, loads of people say yes.
Exactly.
So, of course I forget. The other thing, and sorry, I just want to get the comment off before I forget it, was around, so the social, I was interested in you wrestling with social network measures. Are they predictors of uptake or cessation or harmful use or safe use? Which is sort of a long-standing question in HIV. I think some of it is the clunkiness of measures. But actually, that's why I'm also encouraging you to try and define, okay, so who is the small group who have initiated and sustained harmful use based on their experience and what they're telling you? And I think there probably would be it reminds me very much of the broader drug literature about people's narratives of, okay, so I now recognise I've got a problem and I want to stop. And lots of users in that situation, so it's not everybody, but people going, I'm trying to work out how to get into a more functional pattern for me, will often talk about separating themselves a bit socially from people who had similar levels of use. So, occasional use, fine, but if you're surrounded by, or you're in a regular high level using network and there are a number of you experiencing problems, those people may choose to separate themselves from that if they're on a pathway to lower level use.
I think that...
And it's hard, and I actually recognise technically that's really difficult to distinguish when they're a relatively small group.
Yeah, and also the additional problem with that is that when you take that more subjective thing of asking men themselves about their perception of their own problematics or not, because of the nature of the way that drugs are thought about, there's a tendency for them to inflate the level of problem. And that is clearly the case when you look at the validated measure against their own perception, but even more so when you ask about, do you consider it problematic?
But that reminds me then of, and this came up again about, like, so some of Carla's work about trying to develop pleasure-related harm reduction material, which she did a separate project after we did all this stuff about the neglect of pleasure, and lots of the clients it was presented to hated it. They said, well, you can't talk about drug use like that.
Yeah,
that's bad for us. So and it reminded me there's a real kind of responsibility about, you end up being in a top-down position where you're saying none of this is problematic.
Yeah.
But then if you actually ask people, they say, well, we do think this is problematic.
That's right. Yeah.
And you kind of go, well, where are we supposed to sit there, where you're kind of leading people a bit to go, well, actually, some of this is not that problematic.
Well, you want to do both, really.
Yeah.
You want to be able to do both. I think part of the problem, and I think you're right, that we've got the opportunity to be able to measure some of this here, but it's a complicated issue. What are the definitions of problematics here? But we could do that to some extent now, but I think it's better to wait and look at the longer term stuff, because that will give us a better handle on what we're really talking about. And it's the same issue of what we see in the cross-sectional data and even just the 1 year follow-up data is so volatile and dynamic that it's hard to tell what's a real trend in any direction or not. So I think, given the large numbers, I don't think that we need to wait long, but probably a year or two more of data, and then we can be in a better position to do exactly what you're talking about in terms of those measurements, because I think that's actually a really important point, and we've not had any data before that's been able to do that, and we can do that here for sure. There was something else in there that I wanted to take up. I can't remember what it was now.
I'm going to keep quiet.
Does anyone else have any questions?
Sorry if I missed it, but is alcohol excluded, or did I see that all
We just didn't report it here. Do you remember, I think that the alcohol usage rates were not especially different to the general population.
I think the heterosexual, gay, straight men, heterosexual men were drinking more and smoking a little bit more, but it was the same. There was no association between them.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you weren't seeing association with problematic use and polygraph?
Well, that's the thing that we haven't done. So that's just the really basic thing of if when you do a comparison, the prevalence is not particularly different to what you'd see in the general population. Is it related to rates of illicit drug use, or we haven't looked at that, but we've certainly got the data to be able to do that. Yeah.
I'm curious, in what you guys talked about, and Garrett, you spoke a lot about the social connectedness offered through drug use, and Mo, you commented on the overdose, so I'm just wondering how people that experience overdoses impacting those social connections going forward.
Question. I don't know that we've actually got any directly asking about that.
Yeah.
Do we ask qualitatively about overdose? No, I don't think so. I mean, we could be doing that. I don't think that we expected the rates to be like they are. They're actually 6% of the sample reporting overdose is pretty high. But it's partly a question of what's the definition, what are they actually reporting here. And we gave them the standard sorts of definitions, but we didn't ask a lot of detail about it because we expected that was going to be a tiny number that would be pretty much useless, and it's actually a lot more. Yeah.
And what's psychosis then? Is psychosis also?
Sorry,
Drug-induced psychosis, is that also one of the...
Drug-induced psychosis.
Oh, so that was in the definition, yes.
Yeah.
Thanks, Garrett. That was really interesting. I was just wondering, in relation to the crystal meth, how many people, what proportion are injected who are smoking?
Yeah, was that?
We pulled it out.
We pulled that out. Do you remember off the top of your head?
I think it was about 30% plus.
It was about 30% were injecting, or who had injected in the previous 6 months.
The majority.
30% of the crystal users had injected. The majority, though, was smoking. 70 or 80% who smoked. And then the next one was injecting around 30%, and then the other forms were similar proportions, but slightly less than 30%. We already know that the men who injected were more likely to overdose, and the men who injected were also more likely to be more frequent users. Yeah, pretty obvious though.
Just on what you were saying before around overdose and in a social situation, did you capture at all any information around how confident people are in social situations to manage someone else's overdose or respond to an overdose?
Yeah. No, we didn't. Just didn't talk about that because we were talking about that in a meeting yesterday about that very issue. It does deserve some work of its own, but no, we don't have that kind of detail here. It's the sort of thing that we might be able to capture qualitatively at some point, but not at this point yet. Which sort of reminds me of the other point that I was going to respond to with Martin, which was around networks of men, and that with these data we really do have the capacity to be able to look at their movements in and out of those kinds of networks, which was what you were sort of alluding to as well. And what does that mean in terms of their likelihood to be more or less risky in whatever way you want to define it? Yeah.
I think you should quiz them a bit more about the network. So do you regard if your network has crystal users? So it's a bit blunt. You could say, do you regard them as, functional?
We've got other questions about their perceptions of functional and problematic use and stuff within the gay community, not necessarily within their network.
You should ask them. I think ask them about it in the network, because I think that might divide up some of the men who are happy.
Certainly, some of the qualitative stuff, some of the open text stuff, they allude to that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Just on that note, I guess there's typically a divide between a point at which injecting is seen as a kind of culturally constructed, but nonetheless an arbitrary line in the sand. I'm just wondering whether that was evident in the data that you guys have got, or whether it goes to Martin's point about being more specific about network-based questions, because we know anecdotally that hepatitis C tends to be more stigmatised in the community, and whether that's around its association with injecting drug use or not. But it'd be interesting to see in terms of those kind of approval rates or acceptance rates among cohorts or networks, whether that includes people injecting.
Yeah. We didn't ask attitudinal questions around injecting specifically, did we? I don't think we did. We do know from the analyses that we've done that the injectors are sort of like the more extreme end. So all of the things that we've said about G or crystal can be said more so about the injectors. So there's sort of the tip of the iceberg thing. But those kinds of questions, we haven't really included those, no.
Was it you or your colleagues who were talking about, did you ask about drug acceptability in this? Because the ranking is pretty similar to the general population.
Yeah, that's
heroin
right.
is seen as like.
That was the other thing. That's the other point I was going to respond to.
And crystal is seen as a more significant drug than other ones.
Yeah, and we've got lots of questions around acceptability and perceptions of within the gay community, and there's lots of that stuff around negative perceptions, and we've been talking about the need to compare that with their own use patterns, because it's very likely what you see then is a contradiction, that very contradiction that we were talking about before.
So I think we can thank them again, Garrett and Mo. And please join us for wine and crackers, possibly cheese, I'm not sure.